The barbed wire fence hung limp in the Texas heat, torn apart by last night's storm, and Charlie Benton watched as the German woman prisoner reached for it with bare hands. The guard's rifle gleamed in the sun 20 yards away. Charlie held out a pair of work gloves without saying a word. Anna Müller looked at him, then at the gloves, and for one impossible moment in 1944, the war paused on a dusty ranch outside Hearne, Texas. What happened next would echo through that prison camp for months, but nobody could have predicted how a simple act of kindness would transform hatred into something almost like hope. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning had started like every other morning at the Henderson Ranch since the German prisoners arrived 3 months earlier. Charlie Benton rolled out of his bunk in the ranch headquarters at 5:30, pulled on his worn boots, and stepped into air so thick with humidity it felt like breathing through wet cotton. He was 26 years old, classified 4F, because of the limp he'd had since a horse kicked him when he was 15, and every single day he felt the weight of not being overseas with the other men from Hearne. His younger brother was somewhere in France, his cousin had died at Guadalcanal, and Charlie was here, mending fences and herding cattle on land that had been in the Henderson family for 3 generations. The war had come to Texas anyway, just not in the way anyone expected. When the government decided to house German prisoners of war in camps across the country, Hearne got one of the facilities, and ranchers were allowed to use POW labor to make up for the shortage of workers. Charlie had been against it at first, had argued with Old Man Henderson that it wasn't right, that these people were the enemy. But Henderson needed the help, and the government needed places to put prisoners, and so the arrangement was made whether Charlie liked it or not. Anna Müller had arrived with the second transport of prisoners in June. Charlie remembered that day because she was the only one who didn't look at the ground when the truck pulled up. She stood straight, her dark blonde hair pulled back severe under the regulation cap, her blue eyes taking in the ranch with what looked like professional assessment rather than fear or resignation. She was 32 years old, though Charlie didn't know that then. He didn't know she'd been a Red Cross nurse in Hamburg before the war, didn't know she'd been captured while tending to wounded soldiers near the French border, didn't know that she'd lost her husband in the early days of the conflict and her son to scarlet fever 2 years before that. All Charlie knew was that she worked harder than any of the other prisoners, male or female, and she never complained. The guards said she was trouble because she asked too many questions about safety protocols and whether the water was clean enough to drink. Charlie thought that sounded more like common sense than trouble, but he kept that opinion to himself. The storm had come through just after midnight, one of those savage Texas thunderstorms that turned the sky green and made the earth shake. Lightning had struck somewhere close to the prisoner barracks, close enough that Charlie heard the women screaming from half a mile away in the ranch headquarters. When dawn broke, he rode out to check the fence lines like he did every morning, and that's when he found the damage. A whole section of the western fence was down, 40 feet of posts leaning like drunks and wire tangled in messy coils across the ground. Cattle had already wandered through the gap, and it would take most of the day to round them up and repair the breach. Henderson sent word that the prisoners would handle the fence repair. Charlie was to supervise, make sure they did it right, and the guards would maintain security. Charlie didn't like it, didn't think it was safe to have inexperienced people working with barbed wire and fence posts, but Henderson was the boss, and what Henderson said went. They arrived at the fence line around 8 in the morning, 6 women prisoners and 2 guards. Anna Müller was among them, and Charlie noticed she was the only one who'd brought work gloves. The others had bare hands or thin cloth wrapped around their palms. The guards were Carl Jennings and Pete Morrison, both local boys who took the guard work seriously but not cruelly. They carried rifles and wore the expressions of men who would rather be doing anything else. Charlie had laid out the tools earlier, the fence stretchers and hammers and boxes of staples and coils of new wire. He demonstrated on a practice post how to set the wire tension, how to drive the staples without splitting the wood, how to handle the barbed edges without tearing your hands to pieces. The women watched with varying degrees of attention. Some looked exhausted already, their faces drawn and pale despite the early hour. Others watched with clear interest, trying to understand his gestures and broken explanations. Anna stepped forward when he finished. She pointed at the wire, then made a pulling motion and raised her eyebrows in question. Charlie nodded and showed her again, slower this time. She nodded back, once, sharp and efficient, then picked up the fence stretcher and moved to the first down section. The work began. Charlie moved between the women, showing them how to hold the wire, how to lift the posts, how to dig out the old staples that had held. The sun climbed higher and the heat pressed down like a physical force. Sweat darkened everyone's clothes within the first hour. The guards found shade under a scrub oak and watched with rifles across their laps, passing a canteen of water between them. Anna worked at the far end of the fence line, away from the others. Charlie noticed she'd figured out the rhythm of the work faster than anyone else, setting posts and stretching wire with minimal wasted motion. She worked with her head down, her jaw set in concentration, and she didn't stop even when the other women took a break to drink water from the bucket one of the guards had brought. Charlie was checking the tension on a section near the middle of the line when he heard one of the other prisoners cry out. He turned and saw that Maria, a young woman barely 20 who'd been captured in Italy, had caught her hand on the barbed wire. Blood ran down her wrist in thin lines. The guard, Carl Jennings, was already moving toward her, but Anna got there first. She took Maria's hand gently, examined the cuts with professional efficiency, then called out something in German. The other prisoners looked at each other, but nobody moved. Anna called out again, sharper this time, and one of them hurried to bring a canteen. Anna washed the cuts, tore a strip from the hem of her own shirt, and wrapped Maria's hand with movements that spoke of long practice. Charlie watched from 30 feet away and understood that Anna Müller had done this before, probably hundreds of times, in circumstances far worse than a torn hand on a Texas ranch. When Maria's hand was wrapped, Anna pointed her toward the shade and the water bucket. Then she returned to her section of fence without looking at anyone, including Charlie. By noon, half the fence was repaired. The women were exhausted, their faces red with heat and exertion. Charlie called a break and the guards allowed it, though Pete Morrison made a show of checking his watch and muttering about schedules. The prisoners gathered in what shade they could find, passing the water bucket, speaking in low German that Charlie couldn't understand. Charlie walked the fence line, checking their work. Most of it was adequate. Some was sloppy and would need to be redone, but Anna's section was perfect. Every post was plumb, every wire stretched tight and even, every staple driven true. He stood looking at her work for a long moment, impressed despite himself. He turned and found Anna watching him from 20 feet away. She stood apart from the other prisoners, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. When their eyes met, she didn't look away. Charlie felt something shift in his chest, some old anger or resentment loosening just slightly. He nodded at her work, then gave her a thumbs up, feeling foolish even as he did it. Anna's expression didn't change, but she nodded back, just once, and Charlie thought he saw something flicker in her eyes that might have been satisfaction or might have been relief. The afternoon work went slower. The heat was oppressive and everyone moved like they were walking through water. Charlie found himself working closer to Anna's section, not really knowing why. He told himself it was because she was doing good work and he wanted to make sure it continued that way, but he knew that was only part of the truth. Around 2 o'clock, they reached a section where the storm had not just knocked down the fence, but had torn one of the posts completely out of the ground. The hole was ragged and deep, full of mud and rocks. It would need to be cleared and possibly widened before a new post could be set. Charlie knelt down and started pulling rocks out of the hole, tossing them aside in a pile. Anna appeared beside him without warning. She knelt down on the other side of the hole and started working, pulling out rocks and mud with her gloved hands. Charlie looked at her in surprise. She didn't meet his eyes, just kept working. And after a moment, Charlie did the same. They worked in silence, their hands moving in and out of the hole, sometimes reaching for the same rock, their fingers almost touching in the mud. Charlie found himself acutely aware of her presence, the way she breathed, the small sounds she made when a rock was heavier than expected, the efficiency of her movements. He had spent 3 months thinking of the prisoners as the enemy, as objects to be managed and supervised, and now he was kneeling in the dirt with one of them, working side by side like partners. When the hole was clear, Charlie stood and reached for a new post. It was an 8-footer made of rough cedar, heavy and unwieldy. He tried to maneuver it into position by himself, but the angle was wrong and the weight was too much. Before he could call for help, Anna was there, taking the other end of the post, lifting with her legs the way someone who knew about back injuries would lift. Together they guided the post into the hole. Charlie held it steady while Anna packed dirt and rocks around the base, tamping it down with the heel of her boot. When it was secure, Charlie checked it with the level and found it perfectly vertical. He looked at Anna and she looked back, and for just a second, He smiled. Anna didn't smile back, but something in her face softened, just for a moment, before she turned away and moved to the next section. One of the guards, Pete Morrison, had been watching. He walked over to Charlie, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his expression troubled. He lowered his voice so the prisoners couldn't hear. "You getting friendly with the Krauts, Benton?" Charlie felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with the Sunday. "Just getting the work done. Henderson won't like it if he hears you're fraternizing. Neither will some folks in town. You know how people feel." Charlie did know. He knew that almost everyone in Hearne had lost someone to the war, or knew someone who had. He knew that there were families who would never be whole again because of Germany and Japan. He knew that showing any kind of decency to the enemy was seen by some as betrayal. But he also knew what he'd seen that day, a woman who worked hard and took care of others and did her job with dignity despite being a prisoner in a foreign land far from home. "I'm not fraternizing," Charlie said quietly. "I'm supervising fence repair, that's all." Pete looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Just be careful. That's all I'm saying. Be careful." The work continued through the afternoon. Charlie stayed on his side of the fence line and Anna stayed on hers, but he found himself watching her, noting the way she helped the other prisoners when they struggled, the way she seemed to know instinctively how to solve problems that came up, the way she never wasted motion or energy. By 4 o'clock, the fence was nearly complete. Just one section remained, and it was the worst one, where the wire had been torn and tangled by the storm. Charlie approached it with his wire cutters, knowing it would take time to sort out the mess. Anna came to help without being asked, and this time Charlie didn't question it. She held the tangled wire steady while he cut, pulled sections apart when they were freed, coiled the salvageable pieces and set aside the ruined ones. The guards had moved back to the shade and were talking between themselves, no longer watching closely. The other prisoners were gathered near the water bucket, exhausted and ready to be done. The sun was lower now but still fierce, and sweat ran down Charlie's back in rivers. He reached for a particularly tangled section and felt the barbed wire catch his forearm, tearing through his shirt and into flesh. He hissed in pain and jerked back, blood immediately welling up from a 4-inch gash. He pressed his hand over the wound, feeling stupid and careless. Anna made a small sound and reached for him. Charlie started to pull away, but she caught his wrist with surprising strength and lifted his hand to look at the cut. Her touch was gentle but firm, professional. She examined the wound with the same efficient attention she'd given Maria's torn hand that morning. She called out something in German. One of the other prisoners brought the water canteen. Anna cleaned the cut carefully, her fingers cool against his sun-heated skin. She looked around, then tore another strip from her shirt, the same shirt she'd already sacrificed once today. She wrapped his forearm with practiced precision, her face close to his as she worked, her breath soft against his skin. Charlie found himself looking at her, really looking at her for the first time. He saw the lines around her eyes that spoke of grief and exhaustion, the strength in her jaw, the gentleness in her hands despite everything she must have endured. He saw a person, not a prisoner, not the enemy, just a person who had been a nurse once and still was in all the ways that mattered. When she finished wrapping the wound, Anna looked up and met his eyes. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Charlie wanted to say something, wanted to thank her or tell her that he understood something now that he hadn't understood before, but no words came. He nodded instead, slow and deliberate, trying to put everything into that gesture. Anna nodded back. Her eyes held something that might have been recognition or might have been understanding. Then she released his wrist and stepped back, and the moment was over. Pete Morrison was walking toward them, his expression concerned. "You all right, Benton? That looks nasty." "It's fine," Charlie said, looking at his wrapped forearm. "Just clumsy." Pete looked at Anna, then at the bandage, then back at Charlie. He didn't say anything, but his expression was complicated. Charlie could read the conflict there, the understanding that what had just happened was an act of basic human decency, but also something that would be questioned and criticized by many if they knew about it. "Let's finish up and get everyone back," Pete said finally. "It's getting late." The last section of fence was completed as the sun touched the horizon. Charlie walked the entire line one more time, checking the work, and found it solid. The cattle could be brought back in the morning and the gap would hold. It was good work, better than he'd expected, and he knew that most of the credit belonged to Anna Müller. The prisoners were gathered by the truck, ready to return to the camp. The guards were doing a count, making sure everyone was accounted for. Charlie stood by the fence, coiling the last of the unused wire, and he felt someone approach. Anna stood a few feet away, her hands at her sides, her face tired but somehow peaceful. She looked at the fence, then at Charlie, and she spoke for the first time in English, her accent thick but her words clear. "Good work." Charlie felt something catch in his throat. "You too," he managed to say. "Thank you for the help. And for this." He lifted his bandaged arm. Anna nodded. She seemed to want to say something else, but the moment stretched and broke as one of the guards called for the prisoners to load up. She turned and walked toward the truck, her back straight despite the long day, and Charlie watched her go. That evening, Charlie sat on the porch of the ranch headquarters and tried to make sense of what he felt. The war was still happening, men were still dying, his brother was still in danger somewhere across the ocean. Nothing about that had changed. The woman who had helped him today was still technically his enemy, still a prisoner, still part of the nation that had brought so much pain to the world. But she was also a person who had been a nurse and still acted like one, who worked hard and helped others and did her job with dignity. She was a person who had probably lost as much as anyone, who had been taken from her home and brought to a foreign land, who lived behind wire and under guard but still maintained her humanity. Charlie didn't know what to do with these thoughts. They felt dangerous, felt like betrayal of everything he'd been taught to believe about the enemy. But they also felt true in a way that nothing else had felt true for a long time. The next morning, Henderson called Charlie into his office. The rancher was in his 60s, weathered and tough, a man who had built his spread through decades of hard work and hard choices. He sat behind his desk and looked at Charlie with an expression that might have been concern or might have been warning. "Heard you had a good crew on the fence yesterday," Henderson said. "Got it done in one day, that's impressive." "Yes, sir," Charlie said. "They worked hard. Also heard you were working pretty close with one of them." The German nurse. Charlie kept his face neutral. She knew what she was doing. Made sense to have the experienced worker on the hard sections. Henderson leaned back in his chair, studying Charlie. "You understand the situation we're in here, don't you? We have these prisoners because we need the labor, but we can't forget what they are. We can't get soft." "I haven't forgotten," Charlie said. And it was true. He hadn't forgotten anything. He just added something new to what he understood. Henderson looked at him for a long moment. "All right. I trust your judgment, Charlie. You're a good man. Just remember that people are watching, and not everyone is going to understand nuance in wartime." "Yes, sir." Charlie left the office feeling unsettled. He knew Henderson was right. Knew that what had happened yesterday at the fence could be misinterpreted or weaponized by people who wanted to see betrayal everywhere. He also knew he couldn't unsee what he'd seen, couldn't unknow what he now knew about Anna Müller. Over the next few weeks, the prisoners continued to work on the ranch. Charlie supervised when needed but tried to maintain distance, tried to treat everyone the same, tried not to single out Anna for either attention or avoidance. But he found himself watching her anyway, noticing things he hadn't noticed before. He noticed that she was teaching some of the younger prisoners English, pointing at objects and saying the words slowly until they could repeat them. He noticed that she often took the hardest jobs, the ones that required the most strength or skill, leaving the easier work for the others. He noticed that she had a small notebook she wrote in during breaks, her handwriting tiny and precise, and he wondered what she was recording. The other prisoners treated her with respect, sometimes seeking her advice, sometimes just sitting near her as if her presence was comforting. The guards tolerated her because she never caused trouble and often prevented it, intervening when tensions rose between prisoners or when someone was about to do something foolish. Charlie learned from Carl Jennings that Anna had been educated in Berlin before the war, that she spoke 4 languages, that she had worked at a major hospital before joining the Red Cross. He learned that she never received letters and never sent any, that she had no family left that anyone knew of, that she spent her free time in the camp library reading medical journals when they could be found. In August, one of the ranch hands, an older man named William Reed, suffered a heart attack while working in the barn. Charlie found him collapsed in the hay, his face gray and his breathing shallow. He ran for help but knew it would take time for a doctor to arrive from town. Anna was working with a crew near the barn that day. When she heard the commotion, she came running without asking permission, pushing past the guard who tried to stop her. She dropped to her knees beside William and began checking his pulse, his breathing, the color of his lips and fingernails. She barked orders in English, telling Charlie to elevate William's feet, telling another ranch hand to bring water and blankets, telling the guard to send someone for a doctor immediately. Her voice was calm but commanding, and everyone obeyed without question. She stayed with William, monitoring his breathing, talking to him in a low, steady voice, keeping him conscious and as calm as possible until the doctor arrived 30 minutes later. The doctor, an elderly man named Hearne, who had been practicing in Hearne for 40 years, examined William and then looked at Anna with something like respect. "You kept him alive?" he said simply. "Good work." Anna stood and stepped back, returning to being a prisoner, her face carefully neutral. But Charlie saw the satisfaction in her eyes, the relief that she had been able to help. William Reed survived. He was taken to the hospital in town and kept for a week, but he recovered fully and eventually returned to light work on the ranch. He made a point of thanking Anna, approaching her one day while she was working and offering his hand. She looked at his hand for a long moment, then shook it once, firmly, before returning to work. The story spread through the camp and through the town. Opinions were divided. Some people said it proved that not all the prisoners were monsters, that some of them were just people caught up in forces beyond their control. Others said it didn't matter, that one good act couldn't erase the evil of the regime they had served, that showing them gratitude was dangerous. Charlie heard all the opinions and said nothing. He knew what he had seen, knew that Anna Müller had saved a man's life without hesitation and without expectation of reward. He knew that whatever else was true about the war and the enemy and the moral complexity of it all, that single act was good and pure and uncomplicated. In September, the rains came. Not a single storm, but weeks of rain, steady and relentless, turning the ranch into a sea of mud. Work became difficult and miserable. The prisoners arrived each day, soaked and shivering, worked in conditions that would have broken stronger people, and returned to camp each evening looking like they had been through a battle. One morning, Charlie noticed that Anna was limping. He watched her through the rain and saw that she was favoring her left leg, wincing when she put weight on it. He approached during a break, gestured at her leg, and raised his eyebrows in question. Anna shook her head, made a dismissive gesture, and turned back to work. But Charlie saw her stumble an hour later, saw her catch herself and bite down on what must have been a cry of pain. He made a decision. He walked to the supply shed and found an old pair of boots, good ones that had belonged to a ranch hand who had left for the war. They would be too big for Anna, but better than the worn-out shoes she was wearing, shoes that were falling apart and letting in water with every step. He brought the boots to where Anna was working, held them out without a word. Anna looked at the boots, then at Charlie, then at the guards who were watching from under the shelter of the barn overhang. Her expression was complicated, grateful, and wary at the same time. She glanced at the guards again, then shook her head slightly. So small a gesture that Charlie almost missed it. He understood. Taking the boots would mark her as receiving special treatment, would create problems with the guards or the other prisoners or both. It would put a target on her back that she couldn't afford. Charlie nodded, set the boots down on a fence post, and walked away. The next morning, the boots were gone and Anna was wearing them, and neither of them acknowledged the exchange. October brought cooler weather and clearer skies. The ranch recovered from the rain and work resumed its normal pace. Charlie found himself settling into a routine that included the prisoners as just another part of the ranch operation. He stopped thinking of them as the enemy, and started thinking of them as workers, individuals with names and personalities and quirks. But Anna remained different. She was still separate in his mind, still someone he was aware of in a way he wasn't aware of the others. He told himself it was because she was the most skilled worker, the most reliable, the natural leader among the prisoners. He told himself it had nothing to do with the way his chest tightened when he saw her, or the way he found himself looking for her when the work crews arrived, or the way her rare smiles felt like victories. One afternoon in late October, Charlie was repairing a section of fence near the creek, the same creek where he had fished as a boy, where he had learned to swim, where he had kissed Mary Ann Johnson in the summer of 1938 before she moved to Dallas and married someone else. He was lost in memory and work, his hands moving automatically, when he realized someone was standing nearby. Anna was there, a coil of wire over her shoulder, watching him work. He straightened and wiped his hands on his jeans, suddenly self-conscious. She pointed at the fence, then made a questioning gesture. "Just routine maintenance," Charlie said, then felt foolish because she probably didn't understand. But Anna nodded, set down the wire, and began helping without being asked. They worked together in the comfortable silence that had developed between them, a silence that didn't need to be filled with words because the work itself was communication enough. When they finished, Anna stood looking at the creek, her expression distant. Charlie wondered what she was thinking, whether she was remembering water from her home, whether Hamburg had creeks like this, whether she had children who used to play in streams before the war took everything. "You miss it," Charlie said quietly, not really expecting her to understand. "Home." Anna looked at him. Her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, or might have been just the reflection of the water. "Every day," she said, her English soft and careful. "Every day I miss." Charlie felt something break open in his chest, some wall he'd built to keep himself separate from the prisoners, to keep himself safe from empathy. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "I'm sorry for all of it." Anna held his gaze for a long moment. "War makes orphans of everyone," she said finally. "You understand this?" "Yes." "Everyone loses in war. No winners. Only degrees of losing." Before Charlie could respond, one of the guards called out that it was time to return to camp. Anna picked up her tools and walked away, and Charlie stood by the creek for a long time afterward, thinking about her words, about what she had lost, about what everyone had lost. November came, and with it rumors that the war in Europe might be turning. The prisoners heard the rumors too, and the atmosphere in the camp changed. Some became hopeful, others more anxious. Anna remained steady, working as she always had, taking care of the others, maintaining the dignity that seemed as much a part of her as her skill with medical care. One morning, Charlie arrived at the ranch to find Henderson waiting for him with news. The prisoner program was being reorganized. Some of the camps would close, prisoners would be transferred, and it wasn't clear yet what would happen to the women at Hearne. Henderson had heard they might be moved to a larger facility in New Mexico, or they might be sent back to Europe if the war ended soon enough. Charlie felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had known this moment would come eventually, had known that the temporary situation with the prisoners would end one way or another. But knowing it intellectually was different from facing the reality of it. That day at work, Charlie found himself watching Anna more than usual, memorizing details as if he could hold on to them. The way she tied back her hair, the way she stood with her weight slightly more on her right leg, the way her hands moved when she was explaining something to another prisoner. He realized with sudden clarity that she had become important to him in a way he didn't fully understand and couldn't fully acknowledge. At the end of the day, as the prisoners were loading into the truck, Charlie made a decision. He approached Anna, who was standing apart from the others, and he pulled something from his pocket. It was a small photograph, creased and worn, showing a younger Charlie and his brother standing in front of the ranch house, grinning at the camera like they owned the world. He held it out to Anna. She looked at it, confused, and he pointed at himself in the photo, then at his brother. "He's in France," Charlie said. "Fighting. I don't know where exactly. Haven't heard from him in 2 months." Anna took the photograph carefully, studied it for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. "I hope he comes home," she said softly. "I hope all of them come home." She tried to hand the photograph back, but Charlie shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "So you remember that we're all just people. All of us." Anna held the photograph to her chest and nodded once. Then she climbed into the truck and didn't look back as it drove away, and Charlie stood in the fading light, wondering what he had just done and why it felt both reckless and necessary. The decision came down 2 weeks later. The women prisoners would be transferred to New Mexico in early December. They would have 2 weeks to prepare, and then they would be gone. The news spread through the ranch quickly, and Charlie found that he wasn't the only one who had come to see the prisoners as people rather than enemies. Several of the ranch hands expressed regret at losing good workers, and William Reed, the man Anna had saved, looked genuinely distressed. Charlie tried to work normally in those final 2 weeks, but found his concentration fractured. He made mistakes, forgot tasks, stood staring at nothing until someone called his name. Henderson noticed but said nothing, just gave Charlie long, thoughtful looks that suggested he understood more than Charlie wanted him to understand. On the last day, Henderson gave the prisoners a day off from hard labor and instead organized a small gathering in the barn. It was highly irregular and probably against several regulations, but Henderson had pull with the camp administration and he had made arrangements. There was food, simple but more than the usual rations, and some of the ranch hands had brought musical instruments. The prisoners came in looking uncertain, unsure what to make of this departure from routine. The guards were present but relaxed, and the atmosphere was strange, suspended between the formal structure of the camp system and something more human. Charlie stood against the barn wall, watching. He saw Anna enter and look around with her usual careful assessment. When her eyes found his across the room, she nodded slightly, and he nodded back. William Reed approached Anna and said something to her, gesturing to a chair. She sat, still wary, and he began to talk. Charlie couldn't hear what was said, but he saw Anna's expression soften, saw her nod and respond, saw something that looked like genuine conversation happening between them. Other ranch hands approached other prisoners. The initial awkwardness gave way to something easier, not friendship exactly, but recognition. Stories were exchanged in broken English and creative gestures. Someone started playing guitar and someone else joined in with a harmonica, and the music filled the barn with something that felt like hope, or at least like the memory of hope. Charlie finally approached Anna near the end of the gathering. She stood when she saw him coming, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression guarded but not unfriendly. "I wanted to say goodbye," Charlie said. "And thank you. For everything. For the fence, for William, for showing me that people are people no matter what uniform they wear or what language they speak." Anna's eyes glistened. "You showed me the same thing," she said quietly. "I had forgotten that kindness could exist in war. You reminded me." Charlie pulled something from his pocket, a small New Testament that had belonged to his grandmother. It was worn from decades of reading, the pages soft as cloth. "I want you to have this," he said. "I know you might not share the faith, but it has the words of Jesus about loving enemies and turning the other cheek. And I think those words matter now more than ever." Anna took the book with trembling hands. She opened it and saw the inscription on the inside cover, his grandmother's name and the date 1892. She looked up at Charlie with an expression of disbelief. "This is very precious. I cannot take this." "You can," Charlie said. "My grandmother would have wanted you to have it. She always said that God doesn't see nations or armies, just souls. She would have seen your soul, Anna, just like I do." It was the first time he had used her name, and hearing it spoken aloud between them felt momentous. Anna pressed the book to her chest, tears finally spilling over. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will treasure this always. I promise you." The moment stretched between them, full of everything they had not said and could not say. Charlie wanted to tell her that he would remember her, that she had changed something fundamental in how he saw the world, that he hoped she would survive whatever came next and find peace on the other side of the war. But the words wouldn't come, or came in such a jumble that he couldn't separate them into sentences. Anna seemed to understand anyway. She reached out and touched his hand, just briefly, just enough to communicate what words couldn't. Then she stepped back, and the moment was over, and the gathering began to break up as the guards signaled it was time to return to camp. The next morning, the prisoners loaded into trucks for the last time. The ranch hands gathered to watch them go, an unusual show of respect that would be talked about in town for months. As the trucks pulled away, Charlie stood with his hands in his pockets and watched Anna's profile in the back window until the trucks disappeared over the hill. Henderson came to stand beside him. The old rancher was quiet for a long time, then said, "You did good work with them, Charlie. Don't let anyone tell you different. You treated them like human beings, and you got them to work like human beings, and that's all any of us can do in this world." Charlie nodded, not trusting his voice. "War's going to end one of these days," Henderson continued, "and when it does, people are going to have to figure out how to live together again. What you did here, showing that enemies can work side by side with respect, that's going to matter. Maybe not today, maybe not for years, but it'll matter." After the prisoners left, the ranch felt empty. Charlie went through the motions of his work but found no satisfaction in it. The fence they had repaired together that hot day in July still stood strong, and every time Charlie rode past it, he remembered Anna's hands working alongside his, the silent partnership that had formed between them. Word filtered back over the following months that the war in Europe was ending, that Germany was collapsing, that the prisoners would soon be repatriated. Charlie tried to imagine what that would mean for Anna, returning to a country in ruins, to a city that had been bombed repeatedly, to a life that,